앞으로 경제가 어떻게 될지 알기 위해서는 이분을 빼놓을 수 없다는 얘기까지 나옵니다. 바로 신한은행 오건영 부부장입니다.
내년 상반기 정도에 4%를 조금 상회하는 수준까지 기준금리를 인상하려고 할 것 같다.
어떻게 스티븐 로치 교수는 조금 어떻게 알고 계시는지.
이제 이렇게 마켓 보는 사람들 중에서 로치 교수님 모르는 사람은 없을 거고요. 이분이 이제 그냥 참고로 하나 말씀드리면 2018년도에 이제 트럼프 행정부 당시에 미중 무역 전쟁이 있었잖아요. 이건 이제 구조적인 틀에서 좀 해석을 하셨어요.
네네.
그래서 이제 이게 그때 당시만 해도 디플레이션에 대한 걱정이 굉장히 컸을 때 로치 교수님이 굉장히 아마 제가 알기에는 전문가 중에서 최초였을 것 같아요. 이랬다가는 굉장히 구조적인 인플레이션이 찾아오게 되고 성장 둔화와 함께 구조적인 인플레이션이 찾아오니까 스태그플레이션을 피할 수 없을 거다. 이제 이런 경고를 계속해서 날리셨거든요. 근데 사실 그게 지금 3, 4년이 지난 지금 사실 실현이 됐다라고 봐야 되겠죠. 그래서 저도 최근에도 계속 이제 그 구글 검색창에
네.
이분 이름 친 다음에 혹시 이제 최근에 기사 같은 게 나오는지 참고로 어제도 하나 떴습니다. 그래서 그런 것들이 있으면 항상 좀 모니터링 하려고 노력하고 있습니다.
약간 주의 깊게 살펴야 하는.
네, 그렇습니다. 네.
그렇군요. Okay, so my first question is about the US economy. While there are various opinions about how the US economy would change, it seems that many are assuming that the current inflation would extend even longer. Do you agree on this idea of prolonged inflation? And if so, is there any solution to the structural inflation?
Well, the inflation issue is very contentious in the U.S. Policy and market debate. And my bottom line answer to your question is that while inflation is certainly likely to recede from the current sharply elevated levels of 8.5% to 9%, that the slowing or the disinflation will be less dramatic than many think, and that will leave the Federal Reserve Board with an inflation rate that remains well above its announced 2% target for several years to come. And that will keep the focus on the Fed in terms of its anti-inflation policy stance that was reaffirmed by Fed Chair Jerome Powell's recent speech at the Jackson Hole Symposium in Wyoming.
Professor Roche, it's a very huge honor for me to have a conversation with you. My question is this. What do you think about the Fed's recent response? How much more do you think the Fed should hike the rate?
Well, I think the Fed has only just begun what is likely to be a long period of monetary tightening. As I said earlier, inflation is likely to remain well above the Fed's target through 2023 and quite possibly into early 2024. The Fed can only address inflation from the demand side. Some of the supply disruptions you indicated earlier are not within the purview of monetary policy and need to be addressed in other ways. But what the Fed chair said is that monetary policy now needs to go in the United States into the restrictive zone. And that is a very important concept because it tells you how far away the Fed is from currently being restricted. If we look at the last 60 years, the federal funds rate in inflation adjusted or real terms has averaged 1%. So to get the policy rate back to 1% would just be something that is average or, for lack of a better term, neutral. To move it into the restrictive zone, my guess is it would take something higher than 1%, let's just say for practical purposes that 2% is a better read. Currently, the federal funds rate in real terms is a negative 6%. So to go from negative 6 to 2 to a positive 2 is a huge tightening that will have a meaningful impact in slowing the excess demand in the United States economy and raising the unemployment rate over the next few years. That's the task that the Fed has set out for itself. I think that is the right approach, the appropriate approach under these circumstances.
Okay, Professor Roach, your answer actually reminds me of reading an article about you saying the soft landing of U.S. economy would be no longer possible. So do you still agree with that idea? Do you think still the soft landing is impossible for the U.S. economy?
Well, anything is possible, and forecasts are at best an imperfect attempt to discern what will happen in the future. I would not rule out a soft landing, but I think the odds of that are very low given the full extent of monetary tightening that lies ahead that I just outlined. The last time we had the Federal Reserve Board move as sharply as this against inflation was in the early 1980s under Paul Volcker, where he also had to put the U.S. economy into a difficult strait through a very tough and disciplined approach to address the excess demand that was fueling inflation in the United States. When Volcker went after the inflation problem with the Fed's only real policy tool, the overnight federal funds rate, the real federal funds rate, which again I want to stress is the best way we can gauge the stance of the central bank, went up by about 13 percentage points from 1980 to 1982. This time around, I think the cumulative increase under Jerome Powell will be about 10 percentage points if he does, in fact, make an effort to move into the restrictive zone. That's not as bad as Volcker, but it's pretty close to it. And so I think given the magnitude of the monetary tightening that I envision, the odds against a soft landing are very high, but I would not categorically rule out any possible outcome for the U.S. economy.
I think the current situation that U.S. economy is facing is rather unusual. It is said that people refer the current situation as a Jobful Recession rather than jobless recovery. And Fed has been arguing that the inflation can be tamed because of the strong employment and saving status. Do you think Fed's argument is reasonable enough?
Well, the Federal Reserve is simply saying that it does not want to deliberately push the U.S. Into a recession. But the Federal Reserve is also very realistic about the implications of the coming monetary tightening. And just because the unemployment rate is low today does not mean that it will stay that way as the lagged impacts of the Fed's monetary tightening start to impact consumer and business sentiment, and ultimately, with a lag, the hiring of U.S. workers. Fed Chair Powell, in his Jackson Hole speech, used the word pain to convey the sense that there will be some hardships among businesses and families as an outgrowth of the Fed's efforts to control inflation, and that it is determined above all to control inflation. And the subtext of that message is that if there is pain, it's better to get it over with and do it now rather than have more pain in the future, as was the case when Paul Volcker had to attack a decade of high and rapid inflation. So, I think we can't just look at the labor market today where the unemployment rate is near a 50-year low and say that this is going to be, a recovery that, what was the word you used? A job-full recovery. The unemployment rate will respond with a lag. That's coming. The fact that it hasn't come now really doesn't mean that it won't occur in the future, consistent with what the Fed's message has been in terms of moving to a restrictive policy stance that will impose some pain on American consumers and businesses.
Professor, I have been impressed by your insight into China. During the 2008 financial crisis, China's strong stimulus measures contributed greatly to preventing global aggregate demand from shrinking. However, I don't think it's possible to expect stimulus policies from China right now. If the slowdown in aggregate demand in the US happens, where do you think the global economy can generate global aggregate demand?
Well, that's a very important point. The vigorous growth of the Chinese economy over the past 40 years has been very important for the global economy. And that was never more evident than during and immediately after the global financial crisis. I have done research that showed that, were it not for the resilience of China in the years following the global financial crisis, it is quite conceivable that the world economy would have lapsed back into another phase of global recession. And I cite in particular the years 2012 to 2016, 5 years when Chinese economy grew about 7.5%, and that contributed well over 35% of overall global growth. Excluding that contribution from China, global GDP would have been below the 2.5% threshold we normally associate with renewed recession. The problem is that China's resilience of the past is not evident today for a number of reasons that I and others have focused on, whether it's the deleveraging in property, the property sector, the ongoing impacts of lockdowns associated with zero COVID, supply chain disruptions, and high youth unemployment, and regulatory pressures bearing down on the once dynamic internet platform sector. You couple that with China's very stiff demographic pressures, which have become evident sooner rather than later, and ongoing stagnation in its underlying total factor productivity, and the China cushion that the world had counted on so well in the aftermath of the global financial crisis is not available this time. And so with the US likely to go into recession, with Europe possibly already in a recession, with China growing at less than half the pace it did in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, I think the odds suggest that we are going to move into a global recession in 2023. Who's going to fill the void left by the US, Europe, and China? It's hard to find a nation or a group of nations that has the ability to offset these powerful downward pressures on the three major engines of the world, the US, Europe, and China.
After the collapse of the dot-com bubble in 2000, there had been a period of time when the global economy relied a certain level of growth on emerging market countries. However, the emerging market countries are struggling at this moment.
Well, emerging market countries have, had a lot of challenges to face. They've certainly come a long way. That's certainly the case in Korea. And I've been a big supporter of the dynamism of the Korean economy. Korea in particular learned some very important lessons from the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s. And, I think, other nations in Eastern Asia have been less successful, but have also learned important lessons. To me, one of the most important lessons for emerging markets, not just from that period, but from the global financial crisis a decade later, and from the concerns that are being expressed today, is the need for diversification, not being overly concentrated in exports and therefore dependent heavily or too heavily on external demand, with the world not doing a good job in addressing many of its own problems in the advanced world. Developing countries that are heavily dependent on external demand in the developed world will be in trouble. I think emerging markets also need to be very careful about managing foreign exchange reserves and in managing their exposure to short-term capital inflows, both of which were huge problems in the late 90s. And they need to be especially important today in avoiding excess reliance on debt, presuming incorrectly that debt servicing expenses held down by low interest rates would not be difficult to deal with. And I think the overly indebted position of many emerging markets today, under the presumption that interest rates would stay low indefinitely, is a big and worrisome risk as interest rates now start to rise with central banks responding to higher inflation. So it's a challenging environment for developed and emerging economies alike, and diversification and prudent avoidance of risk are and remain very important for assessing prospects in the broad category of emerging markets.
Okay, Professor Roach, I think this would be the last question for today's interview. And I think that this is not an easy question to come up with a clear answer, but at the same time, lots of people would be very curious about the answer. So given such a stagnant and volatile market situation, what kind of assets do you think the investors should rather focus on?
Well, you're right. It's a difficult question. With interest rates rising, I think the prospects for fixed income assets are probably the most negative of all the major asset classes. So that part of the answer is the easiest. With inflation more of a problem than we had come to think of, over the last 40 years. We go back to some of the inflation hedges that worked in the 1970s and 1980s, and that included a broad array of tangible assets, from precious metals like gold and silver to property and collectibles, and other sort of well-known inflation hedges. But the investors certainly need to pay attention to liquidity concerns when it comes to tangible assets and the volatility in those areas as well. That still leaves a big chunk of asset exposure into equities. I think global equity markets right now are overvalued relative to the likelihood of global recession. So you have to be cautious about near and term downward pressures on some global equities. But, that's a broad asset class. And within the equity universe, there's certainly going to be, a wide range of opportunities that will present themselves to sophisticated and knowledgeable investors, whether they're in life sciences, even some forms of technology, especially artificial intelligence, and in alternative energy, which is so vital in an era of climate change. So I'm cautious on equities as a broad asset class, but within that asset class, there are going to be opportunities that will be attractive over the medium to longer term for investors.
Great. Professor Roach, I think we can call it for today. And thank you very much again. Really, really appreciate it. So I look forward to see you in September at World Launch Forum.
Thank you very much for your questions, very thoughtful questions, and have a good day.
네, 이렇게 스티븐 로치 교수와의 대담을 마쳤는데요. 오늘 이렇게 직접 영어로 질문도 하시고 자유 프리토킹을 하신 오건영 부부장님, 오늘 스티븐 로치 교수와의 대담 좀 어떻게 보셨나요?
네, 일단 굉장히 저는 좀 뜻깊은 시간이었던 것 같고요.
네.
일단 간단하게 먼저 배경 설명을 드리면 스티븐 로치 교수님은 이제 약간 좀 그 향후 뷰에 대해서 좀 네거티브하게 보시는 편이 예전부터 좀 강하셨어요.
네.
근데 이제 이번에도 이제 마찬가지로 보고 계시는데 지금은 이제 연준의 금리 인상에 대해서 바라볼 때 단순히 명목 금리, 지금 우리가 바라보는 금리가 중요한 게 아니라 인플레이션을 감안한 실질 금리가 플러스 레벨에서 상당 기간 이어져야 된다.
네.
이런 포인트를 좀 짚어주셨고요.
네.
이 과정에서 아무래도 미국 경제도 충격을 받을 수밖에 없을 것 같다. 이런 표현을 좀 많이 말씀해 주셨어요. 그럼 이제 저도 이제 이 맥락을 따라가다 보면 과거에는 이제 미국 경제가 흔들릴 때 이머징 시장이 이제 사실은 중국을 비롯한
네.
이머징 시장이 이걸 좀 버텨주는
네.
그런 완충 장치 역할을 했었는데
네.
그 가능성에 대해서도 이번만큼은 조금 좀 부정적이지 않겠나
네.
이제 그런 말씀을 해주셨고 그러다 보면 이제 이코노믹 다운턴인데
네.
결국에는 좀 이렇게 단기적인 시장의 경제적인 충격들 이런 것들이 좀 다가오게 될 텐데
네.
이런 부분에 대해서 우리가 좀 주의를 해야 된다.
네.
이런 리스크 가능성에 대한 부분들을 좀 언급해 주셨어요.
네.
그리고 마지막에 이제 자산시장 투자에 대해서는 주식이나 채권에 대해서는 주식은 좀 오버밸류 리스크가 있다.
네.
그다음에 채권은 금리가 오를 때나 인플레이션 국면에서 좀 쉽지 않다.
네.
그리고 이제 다른 자산을 봤을 때 7, 80년대에 비교해 봤었을 때는 그때는 이제 예를 들어 금이나 은, 귀금속 같은 자산들을 좀 주목해 볼 필요가 있다 정도로
네.
간단하게 코멘트 해주셨고요.
네. 그 교수님이 아까 뭐 내년 경제 전망은 전반적으로 좀 글로벌 경기 침체가 예상된다 이런 말도 하셨던 것 같은데
네네.
저는 들으면서 약간 어떻게 생각하실지 궁금했거든요, 부부장님께서. 네. 어떻게 보시는지.
그러니까 이제 그러니까 제 생각 감히 이제 이분의 그 어떤 주장에 대해서 논평을 한다는 건 좀 적절치 않을 것 같고요.
네.
이제 저는 결론적으로 이제 이분이 말씀해 주셨던 거는 단기적인 침체가 굉장히 좀 다가올 것 같고 그다음에 이 단기적인 침체를 이렇게 완충을 할 만한 그럴 가능성이 좀 높지는 않을 것 같다라는
네.
게 포인트고요.
네.
결국에는 우리가 이제 새로운 혁신이라든지
네.
아니면 이제 기술 산업에서의 새로운 발달들 이런 쪽에서 새로운 성장 동력을 찾아가는 것들 이런 쪽에 대한 말씀을 좀 해주셨던 것 같아요.
네. 혹시 그리고 마지막에 말씀하신 그 주식시장 주식 관련해서는 전반적으로 주식은 조금 위험한 상황인데 그 AI하고 신재생 에너지처럼 반드시 어떻게 보면 약간 성장할 수밖에 없는 산업은 좀 좋게 보신다고 들었던 것 같은데 저는 이 얘기를 좀 많이 들었어가지고
네네네.
좀 계속 들리더라고요.
네, 결국에는 이제 저도 되게 의미 있게 보는 건
네.
결국에는 이분이 갖고 계시는 뷰 자체가 조금 이제 네거티브 하시잖아요.
네.
그럼 사실상 성장의 동력을 찾기가 참 어렵다. 약간의 동력이 있어도 이걸 그렇게 높게 평가하지는 않으시는 편인데
네.
말씀해 주셨던 것처럼 AI라든지 신재생 같은 경우는 좀 높은 밸류를 주고 있는 거지
네.
않습니까?
네.
그럼 단기적으로는 아니면 각 시장에서 이런 주식들이 오버밸류가 돼 있더라도 중장기적인 성장 동력은 이쪽에서 좀 찾아야 되지 않겠나 네, 그렇게 생각하시는 것 같습니다.
네, 오늘 함께 해주셔서 감사합니다, 부장님.
감사합니다. 네.